Welcome to this session on measuring systems change. It's really great to see so many of you here. Who would have known this would be such an interesting, popular topic? I'm facilitating today's session, and today's session is not one where you'll be talked at for 2 hours, but one where you will also get actively involved. But we'll start out with a few presentations from an excellent panel. After that, we will break out into groups, and you all get an opportunity to reflect on what you've heard, to share your own experiences, and to learn from others at your table. More instructions on that will come in a bit. But let's dive in. Many of us, many organizations and people, not least the ones at this forum today, are working on catalyzing systems change. That's what we have in our missions and what we're aiming towards. Most of the big, tough challenges these days can't be solved by standalone, incremental, single-point solutions. We need to work on how to transform complex systems, but doing that is not easy. And measuring it, knowing if change is happening, and understanding why it's happening and what role we might be playing is really tough. Because systems change is a complex thing. There are so many different things we could potentially look at to get a sense of where the change is happening. So what methods or frameworks are useful and when are they useful? What types of data do we need to do this type of work? What kind of time horizons should we work with, given most of us have annual or 5-year planning and funding cycles, but systems change might take decades to materialize? Who decides what is important to look at in a system? Like, who makes those decisions, defining what good change looks like? And how do we measure what matters rather than just what is easiest to measure? These are some of the questions we hope to cover in today's session. Fortunately, we have a great panel of speakers to help guide us through this and inspire us. So with that, I would like to bring our first speaker up on the stage. John Kania is perhaps the perfect person to kick us off here. John has a wealth of experience. He's the executive director at the Collective Change Lab and formerly the global managing director at FSG. And you might know FSG from the water systems change framework that some of you might have used. John, welcome to this panel, and please.
Thank you, Søren. Am I on? You guys hear me? Great. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Sorry? Good afternoon. Thank you. Yeah. I got to wake up. So I'm going to start with a bit of a foundational perspective on systems change. It's one, there are many. It's one that I find helpful. And then I'm going to talk about 2 approaches to measuring systems change that I have found to be both helpful and compelling. And I'm going to begin with this slide. And I have been told that if you put a baby in your presentation, people will like you better. There's actually legitimate research on this. So that's one reason I put this in here. The other is to remind all of us, including myself, of what systems actually are. I think often systems can seem like they're faceless, nameless institutions, but systems are made up of people who were once babies. And if you're the parent of a baby or an aunt or uncle of a baby, you want that baby to grow up healthy, intellectually, physically, spiritually. But you can't grow for the baby, right? The best you can do is sort of affect the conditions in the context around them. So I think that's a pretty good metaphor for systems change, because systems change is really about affecting conditions, actually trying to put better conditions in the way of people who are trying to create change or remove barriers. My favorite definition of systems change, I don't know how many have seen this, actually we had it in the water systems change, is that systems change is about shifting the conditions that hold the problem in place. Colleagues of mine and I, a number of years ago, said we want to take this deeper, and when we look at the conditions of systems change, what are they? And we came up with this very poetically named framework called the 6 conditions of systems change. I'm curious, how many people have seen this before? Okay, for those of you who haven't, a couple of things to take away from this. One is systems change happens at 3 different levels. The first level is what we call structural. You see, it's policies, practices, and resource flows. Often when I talk to people about systems change, they're either talking about policy change or sort of scaling practices, or both. But they're missing some dimensions that are critical when you think about systems change. So the second level is what we call the relational level. The first level you can see, that's explicit. The second, we said, is sort of semi-explicit. And you know, that's relationships and connections. You can't shift a system if people aren't aligned. So that's where relationships come in. You can't shift a system if people are poorly connected. They have to be connected. Stephen Johnson said of individuals who are connected, he said, chance favors the connected mind. You can say the same of systems. So the second level also includes power dynamics. One way to think about power dynamics is that there's sort of three things that you should always be considering. Who makes the decision, who sets the agenda, and who actually controls the narrative. Cynthia Rayner and Francois Bonici, in their excellent book on systems change, wrote about that. The deepest level is what we call transformational systems change, and that's mental models. So we can think about mental models as indigenous might be nature-based, to oversimplify it, and Western modern might be sort of science or technology-based. Those are two different mental models. When we think about sort of what's going on the left and the right, we have two different mental models. So all of these, in fact, you know, affect how you think about systems change. Now, I could go on and on about this slide, and I actually have. I could give an hour-long talk just on this slide. But the one thing I want you to think about, and it's the reason you're here, you already know this, measuring systems change is complex. Measuring that is complex, right? So how do we do this? There are a whole host of things that come up when you think about it. Change happens at multiple levels within a system. It defies simplistic quantification, distributed actions by multiple actors and sectors, lag time between critical activities, changes interact with each other. It's typically not caused by a single actor, and the results are connected and cumulative and building on each other over time. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but the important thing is if you're going to measure systems change, you have to take these into account. And if you're not, then you're in a bit of a denial about how well you're actually measuring systems change. So I'm going to talk about two ways of measuring change. And I talk here about making meaning. To me, that's what's most important, that we're trying to help the stakeholders in the system make meaning of what's going on. Rob Rosigliano at the Omanjar Group talks about, you know, instead of evaluating or measuring systems, we really need to think about how do we help people find their way. So I'm going to give you two very specific sort of approaches to helping people find their way and make meaning in the system. The first is called outcomes harvesting. It was developed by Ricardo Wilson Grau, sort of an international development guru in terms of evaluation. Outcomes harvesting, here's this definition. It's about collecting or harvesting evidence of what has changed. Outcomes are defined as what has changed, and then working backwards to determine what and how the interventions contribute to this change. And Ricardo, you know, worked a lot in international development in Latin America around sort of food systems and agriculture and health and a whole bunch of different areas to actually come up with this process. I'm not going to take you into this example. This is actually, you know, looking at corruption in Burundi. This is a World Bank example of where they did outcomes harvesting, and they were looking at how quickly principals were getting paid, because some weren't getting paid for over a year. What I want to share with you, in all of this, again, it's online, you can get it, is sort of the structure that they thought about. They actually said there are different types of outcomes, institutional changes, which would roughly equate with our top level that I just took you through, learning and capacity changes, which would roughly equate to that relational. And then they said there are other outcomes, and what they list under other outcomes is like mental model changes. And if you look at this picture, and you say, what? You can't see it up close, but if you actually have a chance to look at this, what's in blue is like the mental model change, and it's affecting everything else. So the great thing about mapping like this is you can get a sense of time, what's happening over time. You can get a sense of proportionality with the outcomes. Some outcomes are more important than others. It's a really amazing way to try to make meaning of what's going on. It's a very straightforward process. You know, I invite you to, it's basically we go out, we collect data from a lot of different stakeholders, we try to verify that data, and then we harvest it. It's not that complicated. A couple of things that we get out of it, it's qualitative and quantitative data. I can't, you know, sort of emphasize that enough. If you want to measure systems change, you need both qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative to set the context, describe the quality, and offer meaning. Quantitative to demonstrate scope, scale, and depth of change. And then if you go online, there's a host of resources around this. Just Google outcomes harvesting. And I just want to cite Mark Cabage, who has been sort of my tutor on this, is an evaluator in Canada, an incredible guy. So his last name is Cabaj, and if you really want somebody who really knows their stuff, he's great. So the second, I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about, a very different approach to thinking about systems change, and that's through storytelling. What do you get out of storytelling? One, you get emotion and feelings. Well, systems don't have emotion and feelings. Of course they do. They're people, right? So how do we actually get at that? Okay, we also want to sort of really understand, sort of direction and momentum, et cetera. That's hard to get out of sort of quantitative indicators. But a storytelling approach can take you there. We developed an approach, and we had many people from around the world that were involved in developing this approach towards storytelling, because we wanted to get at the question of, how do we tell system stories in a way that actually approximates the way social change happens? Our definition is system storytelling is a process for pluralistic groups to come together and make meaning of systems they are seeking to positively influence toward equity and justice. Why are we doing this? Well, systems require many different perspectives, right? And by and large, the stories that are told out there right now are, Joseph Campbell called them the hero's journey. It's one person who rises above the challenges. And that's not how systems change happens, so we have to find a different way. And we can also, through these storytelling practices, which are relational, keep people together. You can't see up here, I'm sorry, with the group that we worked with, which were storytellers from around the world that had at least one foot in social change, we came up with different themes of how to think about system storytelling. So one is multiple perspectives. You've got to go out and get multiple perspectives and bring them together. Another is thinking about intergenerationality. Systems don't, just as we know from a standpoint of individuals, we need to think about intergenerationality and intergenerational trauma, we need to think about systems the same way. What's the backstory on the system? So we actually identified 9 different themes that really allow you to sort of take a lens, a systems lens into what's going on in the system. It's just a sort of a look at sort of how we do this work. We do it in circle. So if you want to change the system, get the system in the room. So we get representation of the system in the room to tell stories to each other. And we start at a personal level, we go to an organizational level, we go to a systemic level, and then we harvest. It is highly relational and just a really powerful experience in a different way of seeing into the system. I'm just about done. One thing I will say is I think, particularly in the Western world, when we talk about measurement and evaluation, we tend to cleave it off and say, let's figure out what's going on and then go do our other work, strategy, et cetera. This sort of approach, where you're coming back together, regularly telling stories, system stories to each other, allows you to understand, cohere, because nobody can change a system by themselves, imagine, and re-narrate. So if you want to learn more about this particular approach, you can go to our website, collectivechangelab.org, and look at the system storytelling resources we have. I will just end with this. I'm going to bring back the image of babies. Babies become people, and people make up systems. And I can think of no higher purpose that you can have to measuring systems change than to support the making of meaning within the systems by the people who occupy them. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. So many themes to pick up on here. I'm going to try to just pick up a few. I think one point on the fact that you have these different levels. You have many different causal factors and people and actors at play that all interact. So most of the ways that we are approaching monitoring of progress or results or change are based on very linear causal models. Those type of models are not necessarily very helpful if we deal with systems change where all these different things interact. Also very much like your point on making meaning, because I think some of the things we sometimes conflate when we talk about measuring systems change is, are we interested in measuring change or evaluating whether good or bad change is happening? Are we interested in just learning about whether change is happening so that we and others can use that to make decisions and adapt? Or are we interested in capturing results and evidencing our contribution to that, like a very much an accountability function and not a learning function. And clarifying some of those things, I think, is very useful and important. Now, I'd like to bring in Nivi Sharma. Nivi is the CEO for Bridges to Prosperity, working on rural infrastructure development, currently executing a systems change strategy where they're trying to look at how rural infrastructure can be a lever for wider poverty eradication. Nivi, thank you for being with us today. Please tell us more about how you're approaching that work.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd start by getting a show of hands of, who are the implementers in the room working on social impact? Oh, good. I thought it was a room full of people with deep pockets. Well, everyone else has deep pockets and is hopefully funding systems change. But keep your hand up. Also show me if you're either on the journey to scale or the journey to systems change as an implementer. Okay, so lots of empathy on how hard this is. My name is Nivi. I'm the third generation of leadership within this organization. In fact, today is our 23rd year anniversary of the organization. Yeah. So the organization started with this picture in the National Geographic, landing on the lap of a wealthy American who said, well, if someone needs to do that, either to themselves or their children to get from point A to point B, I bet whatever's at point B is pretty important, and there isn't another alternative. And I can go and build a bridge there. So it started with a really simple story of direct implementation. A man who flew from Vermont to Ethiopia and built a bridge in Ethiopia. Lovely story, beautiful story. And from that grew the mission and vision of this organization. Now, the mission started off as building bridges. And the vision was, unlike education or healthcare, the problem of infrastructure is a very unique one, and you'll hear this throughout the thread of my story, is it's finite in nature. We know how many bridges we need to build. And if we're smart about it, we can fix this problem in our lifetimes. So that's the vision, is to end rural poverty caused by rural isolation in our lifetimes. So I'll start with the happy story. The happy story is how successful we've been. We've been around for 23 years. We've done this work all around the world in 21 different countries, built over 500 bridges, have been really, diligent and thoughtful and almost horribly studious about the way that we've approached this, how we're building bridges, how we're documenting it, how efficient we are, and what impact we're having on the people that we serve. Interestingly, that 30,000 plus meters of bridge spanned, we also have another figure that we sometimes put in there, in $30 million of economic activity generated through our bridges, which is, again, a great thing to measure and track against. So the sad story is that sometimes it feels like we're boiling the ocean. We're just doing our work, cracking away at it in one corner of the world, whereas this is a huge problem. So we didn't have the exact numbers, but just to get to the kind of magnitude of scale, about 1 in 7 people don't have safe, reliable, year-round access to essential services, government services, schools, clinics, hospitals, markets. And out of those, about 100,000 bridges would fix a quarter of their problems. We also got to a magnitude of scale on the solution. So I'm ramping up to how we got to systems change. It's like, first, figure out the magnitude of the problem and the solution. It's only 5% of how much we spend in overseas development aid on infrastructure that would solve this problem, and solve this problem for millions across the globe. So, the sad story, 100,000 bridges need to be built. We've only built 500. A Swiss NGO has gotten about 10,000 built. A lot more work to be done. And so we need to be smart about it. So this was where the big realization came, is that we can't do this alone. That the heroes of the story, again, is not us. We're not the top goal scorer anymore. We need to step back, be a coach, and really enable others. And this is where our pivot came to, from a direct implementer to becoming and thinking of ourselves as a behavior change organization. That who needs to be doing what differently? What do governments need to be doing differently about the way they think about, the way they invest, the way they prioritize in infrastructure? What does aid need to do in order to funnel money to have the biggest bang for its buck that perhaps they don't even know about yet? What does the private sector need? One of the first questions I asked when I joined B2P 2 years ago was, why is American philanthropy building infrastructure in Africa? This is not complicated. We're building footbridges right now, vehicular bridges soon, but Africa builds expressways and methane extraction plants. This isn't rocket science, but it's a new tool in the toolkit. And we need to really inculcate the manuals, the standards, the practices of building particular types of infrastructure that haven't been built before. So changing a landscape of a country, of a continent, to change that landscape and be driven and be informed by the people that matter most, the rural communities that we serve, has really been central to all our thinking as we've moved through this journey into scale and systems change. So don't look at our systems theory of change, but this is some of the ways in which we're thinking about it. Our strategy is based on, let's get the evidence, let's get the irrefutable, undeniable proof that dollar for dollar this works. Let's scream and shout about it from the rooftops. Let's make sure that people thinking about development, whether you're in government or in aid, you are thinking about rural infrastructure. And then let's give you the technical tools you need in order to do it. If you're willing to do it, are you able? And that last box is really our end goal, is governments and investors fund and implement innovative, cost-effective, and impactful rural transport infrastructure. It's a mouthful, but systems change is a mouthful. It's not an easy story to tell. So, the topic of why we're here today, how do we measure this? How do we know whether we're getting closer to this, moving the needle on this? And unfortunately, the answer is, I don't have a great answer to it, but I do have an ideal answer. There's something in our world called the Rural Access Index. It pretty much measures the population of your rural community that lives within 30 meters of an all-season road. Now, it's an SDG, the World Bank is a custodian of it, and once in a while, the system that you're working in, that you're implementing in, will have a big brother umbrella of a measurement. And just looking at that number would be a great way of seeing whether you're moving the needle along the way or not. However, I'll start with my challenges or excuses. But why this isn't great. And it's hard, it's complicated, we're leaning into the complexity of it. But unfortunately, the way that Rural Access Index is measured isn't perfect. We don't measure 30 minutes of travel time. We say that's about 2 kilometers. And then we say, well, how do we measure 2 kilometers? We do it as the crow flies. Now, children don't fly to school, pregnant women don't fly to clinics, farmers don't fly to markets. And so here we are as a small little NGO sitting in East Africa saying, this isn't perfect, this isn't being updated, it's not even being measured. The custodians of this SDG are falling behind on this, they're struggling with it. So here we are saying, okay, we'll develop our own measurement of this systems change. We'll find a really easy, globally applicable way using data that's globally available and free, that's scalable, and we'll try and use our own measurement of it. Now that's a challenge. We shouldn't be spending money and resources on it, but here we are. The other challenges I have that I want to point out is, on the right is a trash can in Oklahoma, and on the left is some maps of a place in Uganda. So there's a town there called Bundimulinga. This is a woman called Karibio. She's walking across a bridge we built with her 2 grandchildren in order to get this beautiful picture for a small BBC documentary that's coming out about us. There are 20 to 40 bodas motorbikes on either side being held off and honking. So it's like this bridge serves hundreds of people, thousands of people in fact, every day, and it's not even a dot on the map. So that's a huge challenge. And when we're solving big problems, the fact that this trash can has more pixels on the internet than a whole town with hopes, with dreams, with opportunities, they don't even get a dot on the map, that's a travesty. And so here we are building out, we're mapping our own things. And over there, you see not even the water is mapped. So as we're thinking about climate change, we don't even know where water is. We don't even have the blue lines that show us where waterways are. And we're building models to show, well, where is the water? Everywhere we build bridges, all those red dots, they don't even show up with the blue line under them when you look them up on Google Maps. There are other challenges, I won't go into them for too long, but thinking about our internal culture, we're not bridge builders, we're systems orchestrators or behavior change organizations. It's expensive. I think Natasha will talk about how long-term horizons really affect things. But at the end of the day, what I want to leave you with is we constantly think about what would happen if we were not there. And then the best thing that I think we've done as an organization is rather than divide it into our impact as direct implementers or systems change, we've broken that down a little further too, is that we know how many bridges we can build. Okay, now we know how many bridges we can support, assist, or influence. Then we know how many bridges we can catalyze, which countries can we go in, and then we can measure the longer term systems change. So it's not a binary this or that. We can break systems change down into smaller steps, into rungs along this ladder, and then that makes it more chewable, and our general ledger is able to also be tagged out that way a little easier. But at the end of the day, internally as a culture, it really comes down to constantly asking ourselves, can we put our hands on our heart and say we are moving the needle on this? And that's not an easy thing to measure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nivi. So many things to pick up on, and I'm only going to pick up on one thing before I hand it over to our next presenter. But I think your point on the importance of culture and mindsets and trust is not to be underestimated. Not only in doing systems change work in general, but when it comes to how do we measure this stuff, we're very socialized into certain ways of thinking about what counts as a good measure, what is good data, for what purpose are we doing something, how do we think about causal relationships and so on. Changing that is not just about getting some new skills, it is about changing our mindsets and how we look at the world and also how we relate between each other, such as how a funder relates to a grantee. I'll leave it at that and want to bring in our next presenters. We just heard a lot of interesting thoughts from someone who's really doing the work on the ground. I'd like to bring in someone who has a bit of a perspective from a funder as well. Natasha Joshi, the Associate Director at Rohini, Nilekani, Philanthropies. And Natasha's been doing some great work and thinking on how to measure systems change and different types of change. Please tell us more.
Hi, good afternoon. It's really nice to see a full room for this topic. And I think especially when we think of measurement, I think the first word that comes up in our minds is data. But I read this really nice definition of data in this book called Data Feminism, which said that data is information a computer can understand. And what that means is that there is information that computers understand, and that's why we've created data in a certain way, but there is information that humans can understand, and it doesn't necessarily need to be only data. And that's where our meaning making comes in, because we have ways of perceiving and sensing many different things outside of what computers can understand. So I think I want to start with that because here's a question for the room. And everybody's coming from many different contexts, and I sort of want to understand that are we able to arrive at a credible, statistically valid definition for something like this, or this, or this. And all of these words, I think, as you will read through them, from our experience, are forces that significantly impact the progress and success or failure of programs on the ground. It affects the lives of communities, and it's this stuff that really influences whether things work or don't work or how it happens. But do we have a way to measure this? And why did we come to this question? I have a little story because this provocation came from one of our partner organizations. They support livelihoods programs for indigenous communities. And so they've done all of the stuff. They've done the market linkages, they've done the skilling, and then for one of our annual reports, they went around trying to ascertain the impact of their work. And they'd gotten all of the great metrics, household incomes had risen and market linkages had happened and products had proliferated, so on and so forth. But we got a letter from the founder saying that, the thing that struck struck me was every time we spoke to anyone in the community saying, well, what has been our impact? They didn't say the household income and they didn't say, the products. They said this. We're not afraid, our children are not afraid. I'm not afraid that I won't be able to survive. And he wrote saying, how do I measure this? Because it's priceless. And that's what got us started on this whole idea that, there are things, there are forces that are operating which are just so important, but the tools that we create to measure certain things, in the process of measuring them, they actually create categories which might not even be real. So for instance, I think this is a really important insight. If all of us have an experience of time, we all know what time feels like. But is a minute an actual piece of time, or is it something we've created? So, when we look at what a clock doesn't sort of, it doesn't just measure time, it produces it. Because time is actually a completely different dimension that all of us think about. And I think in different cultures, for instance, there are ways in which they use the circadian rhythm to actually measure time. And then there are cultures that use memory and temporality to think of time. So therefore, I think the idea, the short point here is that tools matter. And what instruments we use to measure, they really, really matter. And the first thing to do is to acknowledge the fact that we have some tools and they are good, but they are nearly not enough for the kind of complex work that we're trying to do. So we, at the Philanthropy, sort of set off in search of a different tool, and the thing that our approach is always a learning approach. So instead of trying to do this research ourselves, what we did was we essentially tapped into the collective wisdom of 80 plus organizations who are our partner organizations. We asked them, how, and this is just a little snapshot of who they are. They work in rural, urban, tribal. These are the titans of different annual budgets, different thematic areas. But we asked all of them to say that how do you measure progress? Like if you had to not report it, but what do you do? And not just track it, but what is your sense of progress when you do your work? We heard this first. So first thing that always comes up is, we do this, we've vaccinated these many people, we've given this much food, etc. And we sort of said that there is a set of concrete actions that comes up. There's always something, all organizations reported what we called engagement, which is, who has downloaded the reports, how many people have, liked things on their website, etc. But some measure of activity that they're creating within the ecosystem. And it feels important to partner organizations to report that as a measure of success. Then collaboration, of course, comes up. I won't spend too much time on that, it's obvious. And finally, there is, of course, this idea of social change. So deeper things, which are harder, harder to move, stuff that John talked about as well, mindsets, attitudes, etc. So I'm going to give an example just to kind of, because there are a lot of your implementing organizations. There's 3 different organizations that we support. So this is Prayas, and they work with people in custody, so in the prisons, and they try to essentially, after they've come out of custody, rehabilitate them. So these are the kinds of, this is exactly in their words, I've just copy-pasted it, but this is what they reported, saying that, they have lowered recidivism. That's very concrete. You can measure it. There's a number. You can say that, this percentage. And that works. And typically, concrete actions are very quantitative. Engagement, on the other hand, is a little bit different. People define it. But in their case, they said regularity of meetings. So how much is this stakeholder group engaging with me? Collaboration, of course, is this increased acceptance in society and family. So you have to kind of tie up with nonprofits and other employment providers. So how many of those are in their network? And finally, freedom from addiction and violent behavior is something that they also kind of track, but they don't have a number for it, but they put it down, saying that this is what we think of success. Similarly, this is Civis, and they run an online platform where citizens can actually give comments on any legislation that's in draft stage. So a lot of Indians don't even know that this act exists, actually, that you can give comments on draft legislation. But this is the kind of feedback they gave, and I'm going to sort of move to another organization working in the gender space so that you can just kind of start to see like how these data is being kind of reported and captured by us. But the main point here is when we plotted all of these 4 categories, I find that this is kind of the spectrum within which a lot of the data falls. It goes, there are things that are tangible, there are things that are intangible. Similarly, there is stuff that moves fast, that you can get quick results, and there are things that move slow. And this is the sort of framework that we use, because when we use this framework and plot everyone's work, we don't get one dot that says this is the impact. we get this. We get this beautiful, like multi-hued thing. We get a sense of where progress is, what's happening, so much is going on. But I also want to move to the fact that we use the same framework to also measure our own impact. When we said that if we as a foundation believe in sharing power, the first way to share it is to also share being evaluated. So how do you as a foundation evaluate yourself? We found that we could do the same thing for ourselves, except that it just looked a little bit different in our case. But there are things that we do which are concrete actions, which is grants, of course. And then there are things that we do for engaging our community. There's collaboration, there's social change, which is really actually informing philanthropy and informing narrative and things like that. So the idea of putting this whole piece together is really to say that we are just starting out on this journey. We would like a lot more thought partnership on how can we really start to capture qualitative data better. Qualitative data is not the same as anecdote. They're two different things. But how do we build more momentum and more capacity to get to what we are calling more systems conscious, multi-method approaches? Because ultimately, what we do want to do is we have to recognize that current evaluations are limited. And I think that it starts there, by recognizing that there is a limit and that what we really want is we want a higher resolution, a more better telescope. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Again, so many things to unpack there, and so many of you nodding. And I think one thing I think is particularly interesting here and relevant to bear in mind, also that clock analogy is excellent, is that what we measure matters. We need to measure what matters, because whatever we measure, that is what we end up focusing on achieving. That sets certain incentives, it drives behaviors and so on. So we need to be sure that we measure what we actually care about, and that we're able to capture the things that are not as tangible, not as easy to measure. Just like in John's framework, those bottom things, those things under the surface of the iceberg, I think is so important to bear in mind. Now I think, have time for maybe just one question. I'd like to ask you, just pose one question for you to reflect a bit, and then we're going to break out into groups. One question I've been grappling with a lot, I know many others is about how do we, given systems change is collective work, as you also said, John, it's something, not one actor can drive systems change, not one actor is the one causing it. How do we make sure that we are humble and don't overestimate our own importance when we do this type of work and when we try to measure it, in particular if we're trying to get a sense of what role we have played? Any thoughts on how to deal with that? Easy question.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways you could go with that. I think it's a really important observation that you made, Søren, that in almost any evaluation, you're privileging certain perspectives. So I think the first point vis-a-vis consciousness is, are you aware of the perspectives that you're privileging? I talked about system storytelling and doing that work in a circle, and the intent there is that while you can't totally get rid of power dynamics and power differentials, doing circle work well does in fact mitigate the power differentials. And just bringing multiple perspectives together, I can't emphasize that enough, that we really need in systems change work to hear from all the various different stakeholders, and that's going to give us a richer understanding of what's going on. And while we're doing that, to again have the consciousness of where formal authority and power lie, and sort of take that into account.
Any other thoughts?
Could you sort of rephrase that question?
Yeah, I think it's around. Well, one aspect is if we try to just understand where the change is happening. I think that's one question, but we often tend to aim to measure systems change because we want to get a sense of what role we are playing, what contribution we are making. And does that even make sense to ask that question?
Yeah, I think, so the whole, contribution, attribution debate is also quite well established in terms of just, how can you sort of put your stamp on anything that you're doing when things are so complex. Something that really struck me with Nivi's photo when she showed it, the first one, the one where the man is, I was thinking, who was the first person who got across? who threw the pipe to the other one. And so attribution, contribution sort of falls on that kind of. It's complicated for that reason, but I do agree that I think one other thing to think about when it comes to change, right, is this: everyone says change is constant, and I think what we are trying to understand is essentially, change will be eternal in some sense. It will keep changing. So there is no kind of static point to which we are saying that if all of us do this, we will get to this point, and then we can all stop doing something, So I think, I do think some of these things have to be contended with, but I do think they lie at the level of, you have to dig deeper, just in terms of values and why you are arriving at this work, why you're doing it. And I think that conversation needs to be brought into our field a lot more, especially, and I can say this is on the funding side, that I think we do need to think a little bit about some of that stuff, like what has brought us into this world of work, into this world of applied social science. Why do we do it? Why is it interesting? Because it is rooted in values and something that's very, very human.
Yeah. We could keep talking, but I'm keen to shift gears now and give you an opportunity to reflect on what you've heard, reflect on your own experience, and listen to others. And I think we will get some questions up on the screens here. So I'd like you now to, in your groups, at your tables, take turns and share. You don't have to cover all of these questions. Maybe pick the one or the ones that are most relevant or to you, or that you feel you have something to share on, and go around the table and discuss. You have around 20 minutes in total. You get a 2-minute warning before we go back into plenary. So make sure you give everyone time to share. And our panelists and myself, we will kind of join you. We'll walk around and listen in and contribute. So we won't attempt to do a thorough debrief by table, but simply would like to ask you all 2 questions. You could choose to just pick one of them. Was there some interesting point, anecdote, something that came up in the discussions around the tables that you think are particularly interesting? That's one question. Another question is there something, piece of advice, some sort of insight from today that you are walking away with that you want to apply in your own work or in your own organization? Feel free to pick either of these 2. Any reflections? We have some people with microphones. They're going to run around to give you a microphone, so please raise your hand.
Hi everyone, my name is Renee. I'm the founder of Open Embassy. And we had I think the common thread between our shared experiences is the question of how do you navigate between the impact you want to make as an organization versus the people that fund you and how they think about system change. So I see people nodding. We had several discussions, that's nice. And then I think related to this is the importance of not doing it by yourself, but working in coalitions to demonstrate as civic actors that you know what the change needs to be and that others like governments and funders should more or less follow your evidence and experiences.
Such a good point. And I think I heard a table over here that touched on some of the same things. We tend to work in this principal agent type of logic. Someone implements work on behalf of someone else. How do we move towards a more collaborative logic? How do we move towards working as an ecosystem? And how do we do that if we are facing scarce resources and we're all struggling to get the same small pot of funding? A really good point. Any other reflections?
Hi, I'm Phil. I run the Center for Policing Equity and other things. I'm also Julie's hype man, for those who don't know Julie from Thorn. One of the things that we talked about was a word that doesn't get spoken in these kinds of spaces very often, which is power. And how very difficult it is if your organization is set to address systems, but you're either unwilling to speak about power, to challenge it directly, or the philanthropic space is unwilling to speak about or engage with that. And so having more direct conversations about power, enlisting folks who are not so fluent in the language of social entrepreneurship so that they can reveal their experiences of power. Integrating that into the process is necessary for certain forms of systems change, particularly the ones that tend to be at the margins and are most under-resourced.
Really good point. I think we have another hand here.
Hi. I was egged to give this one. So one of the things that was a question over here was talking about like how we define systems. That was one of the things that came from me personally. So I was just bringing this. I think that we also come to this thinking about systems differently, depending on what your area of social justice or what have you are. And I think it's really important, and would have been really important to hear, like, when we say measuring systems change, what systems are we talking about? Some of us are fighting really large systems, and others are, in different types of systems. And I think it's really important to be clear about that, because the measurement is quite different, and the thinking process is quite different. And also, if you have interlocking systems, the measurement is also different. So I think those are questions that we still have to grapple with and untangle.
Really good point. I like that. There are so many, talking about boundaries is when you get into the question of measuring systems, it's like, where does it stop and where does some other system begin? It's artificial constructs that we use to make sense of something, but it's really difficult to set those boundaries of this is what the system is that we're going to measure. And really good point again on the power and who defines what we look at. And we tend to look at M&E as a very technical activity. It's like, you have KPIs and baselines and you collect data. No, it's deeply political and there's power and who defines all these types of things. Any other thoughts?
Something I've been reflecting on as I was listening to the speakers and my colleagues at the table is a dimension that we've missed talking about is time. Systems change needs time, and therefore patient philanthropic capital, which is I don't think we see it often enough. And so if you're talking big changes, then we really need to start thinking about what patient capital really means.
Absolutely.
And are people ready to wait?
Yeah, such a good point. Again, like we all work in certain time horizons and we're not set up to work on very long-term change. And we all have people we're accountable towards and need to report to. So we need to rethink what are those interim things we're going to look at to know if we're on track. At the same time as we hold the space to work towards like a decade or 2 decade sort of time horizon for systems change. We have a microphone coming up to you.
So I don't think I could do justice to the discussion at our table, but I will say it raised really important points, including that all of this has to be grounded in what the people in the communities we're trying to help really want, and that that can be very difficult to do, that funders often aren't listening to that, and other issues of power imbalances. But I have a very specific question. The presentations really resonated for me because we fund a lot of systems change. And storytelling is something that folks we have funded spontaneously have provided us with. And the 4 points that Natasha raised in her things, that's what I have much less articulately called the how of systems change, when most people focus on the what. Where's the money going? What are those things? The challenge I have is that I can get the benefactor that I work for to understand that. But if I want to get the World Bank or UNICEF or USAID or FCDO to fund systems change work, I sort of got to be able to say to them, this is a more effective way to spend your money in the sense that you will get these outcomes, and this is a more cost-effective way to spend your money. You will get a better bang for your buck. And I am really struggling how to move from the qualitative approach, which makes deep sense, and I completely agree with it, and it's great, but I guess I was hoping here to get that. So if anybody's got the answer, please tell me.
Thank you very much. Let me just check the clock. I think we might just have time for one more.
Sorry, thanks for this session. I would attempt to answer your question really quickly from the point of prioritization. I think I'll use an example maybe from some of the work we're doing in Nigeria. So you have different development partners working with DFIs, and with the way things are happening, all the tailwinds going on, and some of the inflationary pressures, because like we're talking about systems change, right? There are more discussions around what real outcomes are going to look like, and aligning that with the government priorities. So the priorities of the government are central, whether it's on national, subnational level. And so getting the DFIs, development partners, donors together in one room and saying, how are we going to align and come up with real outcomes? It's forcing the folks like the World Bank and the UNICEF to align with those priorities so you can have a win. That's one. I hope, but this is in the African context, right? But in our group, I just want to give kudos to Maria, who is our leader in the group here. So as she was speaking, there were common themes that came out in terms of system change. Number one is data-driven evidence. Number two is the importance of communication. Number three is around monitoring and evaluation. Number four, which is really key, is around ownership. If there's no true ownership, then there's no real system change. Somebody has to own that process. Number five is commitments. Number six is diversity. So there has to be understanding diversity, and diversity must be incorporated in systems change. Number six is around the legal aspect, which is typically forgotten. Where does the legal framework play in systems change? And the last one is around sustainability. Over.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll have to end it there. We are at time. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time and share your experiences, and for the organizers.